You can't seriously let her sit in first class. She looks like she escaped from a dojo. The flight attendant's voice rang out louder than she probably intended. A few chuckles followed from passengers already seated. One man didn't even bother hiding his phone, clearly recording. And the woman in question? She said nothing. Henrietta Lawson simply extended her boarding pass with a calm, gloved hand. Her white karate gi was neatly pressed, her black belt tied perfectly, the gold embroidery on one end barely visible. Her hair, white as the snow on Mount Fuji, was pulled into a low, elegant bun. And her spine, straighter than most people half her age. Tell us where you're watching from, and what would you do if someone mocked your grandma like this? Seat 1A, she said evenly. The flight attendant, Kelly, according to her badge, blinked at the ticket, then forced a smile that couldn't hide the sneer in her voice. Oh, you're in first? Well, okay then, right this way. Henrietta nodded once and stepped past her, ignoring the whispers growing behind her. Is this like a prank show or something? She's probably gonna start doing high kicks over the drink cart. Dude, is she serious right now? The walk from the cabin door to seat 1A had never felt longer or quieter. Henrietta placed her gym bag overhead, lowered herself slowly into her seat, and exhaled. Kelly leaned down once more, her tone dripping with customer service fake sweetness. Just so you're aware, we try to maintain a certain aesthetic in this cabin. You might want to change before we take off. Henrietta met her eyes without blinking. I'm dressed with discipline and history. I'll stay as I am. Kelly offered a tight smile, backed off, and muttered under her breath as she turned. 40 years ago, that would have set Henrietta off. Back when people saw her as a threat. Back when she was the first woman in her division to take gold in 3 international tournaments. Back when her name, Henrietta Lawson, carried weight in both martial arts and military ethics circles. But these days, her power had moved underground, quieter, deeper, more dangerous, especially to people who had no idea who they were talking to. An hour into the flight, the mocking didn't stop. Kelly returned with champagne and, with a loud laugh, asked, "Or do you just want green tea, Master Sensei?" A couple passengers snickered nearby. One even mimicked a karate chop as Henrietta took her drink silently. At one point, a teenage girl tried to sneak a selfie with Henrietta in the background. Hashtags were already flying on social media. #karate grandma, #first class black belt. She gone kick the pilot. Henrietta didn't flinch. She wasn't here to fight, at least not physically. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, black leather, embossed with a silver emblem that most people would mistake for an old-school company logo. She tapped twice on a nearly invisible sensor embedded into the spine. No one noticed. What she just activated was far from cosmetic. Henrietta Lawson, though retired from public life, was still the final compliance authority of Ethics Watch Nexus, a global ethics surveillance network used by the FAA, 9 international airports, and 3 private aviation consortiums. She hadn't used her emergency override access in 14 years. Until now. With one biometric tap and a second authentication via fingerprint, she flagged the flight as a Tier 4 passenger dignity violation under the Lawson Protocol, a clause that had never been triggered in public view. Not once. Until now. The cabin lights dimmed for rest, but Henrietta didn't sleep. She stared at the back of Kelly's head as the woman flirted with a pilot walking through. She watched the man in 1B laugh as he pulled up the latest meme someone had just posted with her photo, adding a martial arts filter. What none of them knew was that Ethics Watch's live data feed had already pinged airport compliance officers in Frankfurt, Incheon, and Narita. A soft, amber warning flashed across their control panels. Lawson Protocol, activated, temporary suspension suggested. The plane landed in Tokyo on time. Kelly smiled one last time as she opened the first-class curtain. "Well, we hope you enjoyed your flight, ma'am. Maybe next time. Dress a little more first-class appropriate, yeah?" Henrietta stepped out, adjusted the sleeves of her gi, and gave a small bow. "Thank you. You've been enlightening." She walked through the jet bridge and disappeared into the crowd. 12 minutes later, a message pinged on the internal system of Western Wings Airlines HQ. Ethics tier downgraded to non-compliant. Temporary flight suspensions initiated at 9 partner airports: Narita, Heathrow, Incheon, Changi, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, Toronto Pearson, JFK, Doha. The airline's COO choked on his coffee. In the following hours, 112 international flights were rerouted or denied boarding. 38.7 mm in gate access was frozen pending review. 3 of the airline's executive VPs received subpoenas for discrimination review under FAA charter updates. The final line of the internal report read, "Triggered by H. Lawson, Authority, Founder, Ethics, Watch Override Code, Lawson Protocol, Class A." Back in Virginia, a quiet notification flashed on Henrietta's home device. "Compliance sweep complete. 9 airports suspended Western Wings. Charter review scheduled." She sipped her green tea, opened the paper, and turned to the crossword. No news channel would carry the story. No Twitter war would break out. But behind closed doors in airline boardrooms, her name would echo for weeks. And for the people on that flight who thought she was just some crazy old karate lady, they'd soon learn. You don't mock the woman who wrote the rules. 2 days after the flight landed in Tokyo, Western Wings Airlines was in full crisis mode. The press hadn't gotten hold of the story yet, but internally, the cracks were spreading like wildfire. 9 of their highest traffic airports had suspended boarding access. All flights involving Tokyo, Frankfurt, and Heathrow were forced to reroute or cancel. Passengers were posting complaints about mysterious delays, gate shutdowns, and crew vanishing mid-shift. The legal department couldn't keep up. The CEO of Western Wings, Blaine Corbin, paced the length of his 39th floor office in Chicago with the same rage he once reserved for Wall Street analysts. How the hell does a 70-year-old woman cause this much damage without even raising her voice? He hadn't slept. Neither had his general counsel, because while the public didn't know yet, Ethics Watch Nexus did. And the only person on Earth with authority to activate a full Tier 4 passenger dignity violation? Henrietta Lawson. Across the world, Henrietta was doing something far more mundane. She was in her garden. The cherry tomatoes were coming in early this year. She crouched beside the vines, humming softly, trimming dead leaves with precision. Her phone buzzed once in her apron pocket. She didn't check it. Instead, she turned to the garden bed, pulled a small sprig of mint, and smiled. The wind carried the faintest scent of pine and soil. Peaceful, silent, controlled. That's how she liked it. Back in Tokyo, a junior operations manager, fresh out of Harvard, trying to impress the execs, finally pieced together the timeline. She tapped into the system mid-flight, he reported during an emergency Zoom call. It was silent, completely silent. But the override was legit. I verified the access logs. It was her biometric signature. Blaine stared at the screen. We didn't even know she was still active. She wasn't, the guy said, until that flight. There was a long pause. Then someone else, older, quieter, spoke up from the corner. Henrietta Lawson used to be on the Federal Aviation Ethics Board. In the 90s, she created the Passenger Dignity Charter. Another executive blinked. The thing we all pretend to comply with, but don't? That one. No one in the room said it aloud, but the tension was thick. They had mocked the woman who literally wrote the rules. Back in Virginia, Henrietta finally checked her phone. There were messages, lots of them. A few were from ethics compliance officers, confirming the suspensions had gone through. One was from an old friend at the FAA. "It's been 14 years since you've used your override. Everything okay?" Henrietta replied simply, "I'm fine. The system works. That's all that matters." She poured herself a cup of green tea, sat on her porch, watched the birds, let the silence do its work. Later that night, She opened her laptop and logged into a secure server. She didn't need to, but she always reviewed the Ethics Watch logs herself. She pulled up the cabin surveillance footage. She watched Kelly's smirking face as she leaned over Henrietta with that thinly veiled sarcasm. She saw the other passengers taking photos, the man pretending to sneeze while saying, "Hiya," the teenage girl giggling into her phone, and she paused the frame. One click, and the footage was uploaded to a private archive labeled, "Flagged for FAA Charter Review. Cultural Bias Pattern. Third Recurrence." Henrietta didn't act emotionally. She acted systemically. Elsewhere, in a small apartment in New Jersey, Kelly sat on her couch in silence. She had just gotten off the phone with Western Wing's HR director. She'd been pulled from her next 5 flights. "Pending internal review," they'd said. "But I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered to no one. Her roommate, a flight attendant with another airline, looked up from her cereal. "You mocked a first-class passenger on camera. That alone can get you fired, Kel." "She was wearing a karate costume. What was I supposed to do? Pretend she wasn't a walking joke?" "She was a paying customer." Kelly didn't respond. But the worst part wasn't the suspension. It was the silence. Because she'd heard a rumor just an hour earlier that the woman in the GI was someone important. Not celebrity important, system important. And Kelly had messed with her. At FAA headquarters, the audit team began their initial phase, reviewing every documented instance of disrespect toward elderly passengers over the past 36 months. Western Wings topped the list, not just for this flight, but 2 others involving elderly veterans, and one incident with a disabled grandmother returning from cancer treatment. Henrietta didn't say a word to the press. She didn't call for cancellation. She never posted on social media. But the system she helped build, it moved like a storm. The next morning, Henrietta received a package on her doorstep. No return label. Inside was a handwritten note. "I know who you are now. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't see you. I see you now." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a signature. She folded the note, tucked it into her ethics journal, and continued sipping her tea. And so, the woman they thought was a joke quietly restructured a global airline without lifting her voice or throwing a punch. Because some people fight with power, others fight with silence. Henrietta, she fought with the system. And won. 3 weeks passed. Western Wings was still scrambling. The FAA had not only upheld Henrietta's override, they'd expanded the investigation. Other airlines were watching nervously, wondering if their own crews had ever mocked the wrong person in the wrong seat. But while executives and lawyers scrambled in glass offices across the country, one name kept popping up behind closed doors: Henrietta Lawson. One afternoon in Arlington, Virginia, Henrietta stood at her kitchen counter, rolling dough for fresh soba noodles. The radio played softly in the background, a jazz station, smooth and unbothered. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She wiped her hands, picked it up, and saw a message from an old contact she hadn't heard from in over a decade. "Can you take a secure call in 10? She didn't hesitate. She tapped back one word. Yes. 10 minutes later, a line connected through a military-grade encryption system, one that hadn't been used since her time on the Federal Aviation Ethics Board. A voice came through, calm, measured. "Ms. Lawson, we're assembling a new charter review panel. Independent, unpaid, uninfluenced. We need you on it." She took a slow sip of tea before responding. "The current system doesn't need review. It needs to be burned down and rebuilt from scratch." A long pause. Then the voice replied, "That's exactly why we're calling you." The flight attendant incident wasn't isolated. That much was clear now. Since Henrietta's override, Ethics Watch Nexus had flagged 37 incidents in the past 18 months. Cases where elderly, disabled, or culturally dressed passengers had been publicly mocked, denied dignity, or targeted by crew bias. Even worse, many had been brushed aside in customer service apology emails and never made it to review. The industry had a pattern. Henrietta's flag just made it visible. She traveled to Washington, D.C. quietly. No press, no escort, no fuss. The meeting was held in a federal building few people knew still operated. Inside, a group of 11 sat around a large, bare table. Lawyers, civil rights advocates, former airline executives, and 2 current FAA officials. But when Henrietta entered, the room shifted. One by one, they stood. Not from formality, but something closer to awe. This wasn't a consultant. This was the architect. A younger man at the end of the table cleared his throat. "We've reviewed your protocol. The loss and tier system is airtight, but no one's been brave enough to fully enforce it. Until you." Henrietta looked around, her tone even. "I didn't enforce it out of anger. I enforced it because it was ignored." One woman nodded. "We want you to revise it, make it stronger, expand it across not just airlines, but partner airports, travel platforms, and training institutions." Henrietta sat back. "That's not a revision. That's a revolution." They didn't deny it. Over the next several hours, Henrietta outlined what would become the Passenger Dignity Framework, a living document to be reviewed biannually, required for all FAA-approved carriers. 3 core pillars: visual bias detection, AI-trained tools to flag in-flight crew patterns of targeting passengers based on age, clothing, or racial presentation. Passenger Dignity Index, PDI, a live ethics score attached to each airline, visible to all federal partners and booking platforms. Immediate override access, a legally binding clause giving ethics-certified passengers emergency authority to trigger compliance review if their dignity was publicly violated. One of the FAA directors raised an eyebrow. "You want civilians with that kind of power?" Henrietta answered without blinking. "They already have cameras. You've just never respected what they capture." That night, she walked the National Mall alone. No guards, no fans, just her. The cherry blossoms had just started blooming. Their petals scattered across the walkway like memories, fragile but persistent. She thought about all the people who had been laughed at quietly on flights. The disabled veteran who had his cane taken for safety reasons. The Sikh man who was pulled aside 3 times for random checks. The elderly woman whose rosary beads were confiscated in case they were a weapon. And now, they would finally have a system that saw them. Meanwhile, back at Western Wings, panic had turned to desperation. Flights were down. Ethics scores were plummeting. 2 major international airports had sent warnings that if the airline didn't adopt the new PDI, their gates would be permanently reassigned to more compliant competitors. CEO Blaine Corbin sat in silence as his team laid out the cost. 78.3 mm in lost bookings, 112 international cancellations, 4 airport partnerships on the verge of collapse. Internal crew morale at an all-time low, investor calls doubling daily. But worst of all, the FAA had gone quiet. They were no longer answering Western Wing's calls because they were too busy writing a new charter with Henrietta. 3 days later, the FAA made a quiet public announcement. "We will be adopting the Passenger Dignity Framework across all U.S. certified carriers effective Q3. Charter authored by H. Lawson. Enforcement by FAA and Ethics Watch Nexus." That was all it said. No press conference, no fanfare. But the industry felt the quake. Within 24 hours, 4 rival airlines issued early adoption statements. 2 booking platforms publicly pledged to show ethics scores beside flight prices. 1 foreign airline requested consultation for international compliance. And Western Wings, they issued a statement too. A carefully crafted PR apology video, soft piano music, an actor-voiced narrator. At Western Wings, we believe in respect and dignity for all our passengers. We are learning, and we will do better. It aired during prime time, but Henrietta never watched it. Back home, she sat at her garden table, a clean copy of the new charter printed in front of her. She flipped to the last page. There, in quiet black ink, were the final words. This framework is dedicated to those who are mocked in silence and never heard. May you be seen now. She signed it. Henrietta Lawson, author, Passenger Dignity Framework. Former chair, FAA Ethics Board, Karate Black Belt, 7th Dan, she smiled. Then returned to her tea. The press didn't know at first. When the FAA issued their quiet announcement about the Passenger Dignity Framework, journalists rushed to make sense of it. A few noticed the initials, authored by H. Lawson. But no one could pin down exactly who that was, until someone did. It started as a thread on an aviation ethics forum, an obscure space where compliance officers and ex-FAA staff swapped theories and horror stories about the industry. A user posted a screenshot of an old faded document from 1996, FAA Ethics and Enforcement Pilot Program. Lead architect, Henrietta Lawson. Another replied, "Wait, Lawson? As in the Henrietta Lawson? Didn't she vanish after the '97 override scandal? Why would she be on a flight in karate gear?" Then someone found her LinkedIn. Still active, still listed as founder, Ethics Watch Nexus. And within hours, it hit Twitter. The hashtag started trending within minutes. Hashtag Henrietta Lawson. The quiet override. #Karate Grandma. Some of them were mocking. Most were reverent. People started sharing clips of elderly family members being ignored by gate agents. Passengers in religious clothing being randomly checked. Moms with toddlers denied pre-boarding. And suddenly, the woman in the karate gi wasn't strange anymore. She was symbolic. At Western Wing's HQ, panic turned into full-scale firestorm. A junior social media manager burst into the conference room mid-meeting. Her identity just got out. Twitter's on fire. Look. She held up her phone and hit play. Henrietta Lawson was the author of the original Passenger Ethics Index. She created the override protocol Western Wings tried to dismiss, and y'all mocked her on a flight, in her own system. It had over 2.4 million views in 5 hours. One executive stood, pale. "We didn't just mess with a grandma. We messed with the one woman who wrote the rules." Meanwhile, Henrietta sat calmly at her garden table. Her niece, Lila, stormed into the backyard waving an iPad. "Auntie, you're going viral. You're literally a meme. Look at this. When Grandma's Wi-Fi also controls your airport gate." Henrietta took the iPad, blinked once, then chuckled. I suppose that's one way to be remembered. She didn't care about the fame. She cared that the framework was working, that for the first time in decades, people weren't just apologizing. They were being held accountable. The next morning, a letter arrived by courier. Thick envelope, embossed seal. It was from the President's Office of Aviation Affairs. Inside was a formal invitation. "Dear Ms. Lawson, we would be honored if you would appear before the Senate Committee on Aviation Ethics next week as the opening witness. Your original work set the foundation for modern ethics oversight. Your recent actions have reignited that spirit." Henrietta didn't hesitate. She picked up a pen and signed the RSVP. Confirmed. That same day, Western Wing's CEO Blaine Corbin held a press conference. He stood stiffly at a podium, flanked by 2 PR reps and a visibly nervous HR director. "We take full responsibility for what occurred on Flight 762. We deeply regret the treatment of Ms. Lawson. Effective immediately, our entire flight operations team will undergo retraining in accordance with the Passenger Dignity Framework." It sounded clean, polished. But behind the scenes, the truth was more brutal. 3 C-level resignations, an internal ethics audit spanning 5 years, a $41 million class action lawsuit filed by former passengers with similar experiences. The walls weren't just cracking, they were collapsing. Then came the email Henrietta had been waiting for. Not from the FAA, not from the media, but from a woman named Joanna Lee, a former flight attendant who'd been quietly blacklisted after reporting abuse in her crew 2 years earlier. The subject line read, "You don't know me, but I know you saved me." In the email, Joanna described years of witnessing passengers being degraded in subtle, policy-shaped ways. She'd tried to speak up. HR had silenced her. Colleagues ostracized her. But now, with the ethics score framework active, her voice mattered again. I didn't think I'd ever put the uniform back on, but this morning I applied again, because you reminded me what flying is supposed to mean. Henrietta read the email 3 times, and for the first time that week, she teared up. The Senate hearing arrived. Henrietta walked into the chamber alone. No entourage, no security, just a crisp gray blazer, her signature white belt embroidered with Japanese kanji, and a calm, purposeful expression. Reporters were lined up against the walls. Cameras clicked, microphones extended like vines. One whispered to another, "That's her. The one who took down an airline from 14A." Inside, the room fell quiet as she took her seat. The chairwoman of the committee tapped her gavel once. "Ms. Lawson, we thank you for your service. The floor is yours." Henrietta adjusted the mic. "This is not about revenge," she began. "It's about remembering who airports are built for. They are not temples of efficiency. They are homes of humanity in transit. And no one, not the old, the poor, the differently dressed, should be made to feel lesser just for flying." You could hear a pin drop. After the hearing, a clip of her opening statement went viral. 17 million views. One YouTube commenter wrote, "I showed this to my grandma. She cried and said, 'That's the kind of woman I used to be.'" By the end of the week, 9 major airports formally suspended partnership with Western Wings until full compliance with the new framework. 2 international alliances followed suit. Investors began pulling back, and quietly, without cameras or press releases, Kelly, the flight attendant who mocked Henrietta, submitted her resignation, not because she was forced, but because she finally understood what she'd done wrong. Back in Arlington, Henrietta returned to her dojo for the first time in years. The doors creaked open to reveal 6 students waiting in silence. Word had gotten out. One young woman stepped forward, bowing deeply. "Sensei Lawson, will you teach us?" Henrietta smiled. She stepped barefoot onto the mat and simply said, "Let's begin." It didn't take long for the ripples to turn into waves. Within 72 hours of the Senate hearing, the passenger dignity framework wasn't just an idea. It became an enforced condition. Henrietta hadn't even made a single media appearance after the testimony. She didn't need to, because now airports were choosing sides. 9 of them, some of the most trafficked in North America, publicly adopted the new framework as a non-negotiable compliance requirement, meaning if an airline didn't meet the dignity metrics by quarter's end, gate access revoked, flight scheduling licenses reviewed, public scorecards published. For the first time, ethics were measurable and visible. At Western Wing's headquarters, the mood had shifted from panic to paralysis. Legal was working overtime. PR was buried. But none of it could undo what was now moving silently but relentlessly across the industry. A system Henrietta had quietly co-authored decades ago, now awakened and fully weaponized. What stunned them wasn't just how fast it spread. It was how organized it was. A week after Henrietta's testimony, a secure web portal went live under FAA authorization. Nexus View, AVI. It ranked airlines not just by on-time performance or baggage mishandling, but by dignity treatment scores, incident transparency, internal response time, crew de-escalation training compliance, and public ethics responses. Western Wings scored a 32 out of 100. Red Zone. Public. Shareable. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Henrietta received a visitor. She was trimming her garden when the knock came. It wasn't a courier or a news crew this time. It was a man, late 30s, sharp suit, tired eyes. He introduced himself as Nathan Huang, Director of Compliance Strategy at JetPath International. "You don't know me," he began, "but I helped write the ethics response manual that got scrapped last year. I read your testimony, and I'd like to ask for your help." Henrietta wiped her hands on a towel and gestured to the bench under the magnolia tree. They sat. Nathan explained that JetPath had never been a leader in ethical reforms, but the company was now reeling. Staff morale was down. Bookings had dropped 18% in 2 weeks. 4 airports had quietly flagged their dignity score. "We're not just losing customers," Nathan said. "We're losing trust, and if we don't fix this the right way, not the PR way, we're next." Henrietta nodded slowly. "And what is it you think I can do?" He looked at her, not like she was a consultant, but like a compass. "Build us a path back." That weekend, Henrietta flew, ironically, with JetPath. Coach seat, no fanfare, no karate guy. She simply boarded, observed, and took notes. The crew didn't recognize her. She didn't mind. What she noticed were small things. A disabled passenger left waiting at the gate. An overworked flight attendant silently wiping her tears between beverage carts. An elderly man asking for help finding his medication in his carry-on. Ignored twice. These weren't headlines. They were warning signs. When the flight landed, Henrietta sent a one-line email to Nathan. "We need to begin with culture, not compliance." Over the following weeks, a quiet revolution unfolded behind closed doors. Henrietta didn't issue threats. She issued standards. She worked with JetPath's legal, HR, and crew development units to build the first-ever passenger dignity certification program, piloted across 2 major routes. Flight crew were trained not just in response protocols, but in how to recognize implicit bias, how to manage trauma responses calmly, how to create a culture of presence, not just efficiency. And more importantly, passengers were included in post-flight dignity surveys. Nathan called it radical transparency. Henrietta called it long overdue. Back at Western Wings, the dominoes kept falling. More airports joined the framework. More news stories exposed past incidents. And then came the real blow. Ethos Core, a global ESG and airline investment platform, downgraded Western Wings' ethics score, triggering automatic capital freezes across 2 major hedge fund partners. $178 million in financing evaporated overnight. Their CEO called an emergency board meeting. For the first time in 15 years, his job was no longer safe. And someone on the board asked the question that had been circling for days. Should we ask Henrietta Lawson to consult for us? Silence. Then, from the VP of International Strategy, "She doesn't consult for people who mock her in aisle 1A. Meanwhile, Henrietta's dojo was no longer just a local martial arts school. It had become a gathering place for the quiet reformers, former flight attendants, ethics lawyers, airport employees, even pilots. They didn't come to learn kata. They came to relearn dignity. And Henrietta led them with the same stillness she had shown on that flight. No yelling, no spectacle, just conviction and clarity. One night, after class, a woman stayed behind. She introduced herself as Cynthia Morales, a corporate VP who had once signed off on cost-cutting crew downsizing initiatives, some of which indirectly led to crew burnout and, yes, passenger mistreatment. "I watched the hearing 3 times, she said softly, "and I cried because I realized I helped build the mess." Henrietta didn't shame her. She handed Cynthia a blank sheet of paper. "Then help us unbuild it." In the 4th week after the incident, the FAA issued an interim update. All airlines operating in U.S. airspace must submit ethics compliance metrics by Q3 or face conditional route evaluations under the Passenger Dignity Framework. It wasn't just a policy shift. It was a line in the sand. And behind it, standing quietly in her garden once again, was the woman in the white belt. No longer mocked, no longer invisible. Henrietta read the notice, and instead of smiling, she finally let out the breath she'd been holding for 30 years. The phrase didn't exist in aviation law before, but within 2 months of Henrietta Lawson's Senate hearing, It became a quiet fixture in internal compliance circles. The black belt clause. It wasn't a legal mandate. It was worse. For airline execs, it was a reputation bomb. The clause signaled this. If a passenger was publicly humiliated and later revealed to hold regulatory or ethical oversight power, the entire airline would be subjected to immediate ethics override review. No appeals, no delays. Guess who had written the policy draft? Henrietta didn't name it. Someone online did. But she approved of it. Back in her dojo, class was full every night. Not just students, but professionals. Airport directors, HR heads, airline whistleblowers, former crew members who'd walked away out of burnout or shame, and one unexpected face. Jillian Carver, the former flight attendant who had mocked Henrietta that day. She didn't say a word when she entered, just bowed and sat in the back corner. Henrietta noticed her immediately, but she didn't stop class, didn't call her out. Instead, during the water break, she walked quietly over and sat beside her. Jillian looked down. "I wanted to apologize, but I knew you didn't want words." Henrietta replied softly, "Then stop talking." Jillian blinked. Henrietta handed her a folded gi uniform. "Start showing." The next week, JetPath International held a live-streamed internal summit. CEO Jordan Elkins appeared on camera flanked by two unlikely guests, Nathan Huang and Henrietta Lawson. He opened bluntly. "We failed. We forgot the passenger in our pursuit of profit. That stops today." Then Henrietta spoke, not from a script. She looked directly into the camera, as if speaking to every crew member, every passenger, every daughter or father who had ever felt less than human at 36,000 feet. Dignity isn't a department. It's not a slogan. It's what you hand someone when no one else is watching. The live stream was only supposed to reach staff. It hit YouTube by nightfall. Meanwhile, Western Wings was unraveling fast. Their temporary suspension from 9 major airports meant rerouting hundreds of flights, refunding thousands of tickets, and facing media backlash on every continent. They tried to frame it as system maintenance, but the public wasn't buying it anymore, especially after someone leaked a video montage of other incidents. Clips of crew berating passengers, gate agents mocking accents, pilots refusing special assistance for elderly travelers. The closing image? Henrietta, calm, silent, alone in 1A. Caption: "You didn't see who she was. You only saw her age." That same week, FAA sent an encrypted memo to Henrietta. A pilot program was greenlit, an ethics override dashboard integrated into airport operations at 6 major hubs. She'd be serving as chief ethics architect. Each airline had to submit real-time behavioral incident reports and crew-level debriefs within 12 hours of any escalation. Henrietta insisted on one more thing: passenger voice logs, anonymous but mandatory. Short feedback after flights. Just 5 questions, but 5 that would reshape how airlines understood service. The project would be called the Fair Flight Initiative, and she would sign every ethics protocol personally. Back at the dojo, Jillian was still showing up, quiet, present. She didn't try to befriend Henrietta. She didn't try to atone. She swept the floor after class, helped beginners with their stance, practiced kata in silence. Then one night after class, Henrietta walked over to her. "You were scared that day, weren't you?" Jillian paused. "Yes, but not of you." Henrietta tilted her head. "I was scared of what you reminded me of. Strength I didn't have. Decency I forgot." Henrietta smiled. "Then don't forget again." And she handed Jillian her yellow belt, a symbol of restart. In DC, lobbyists began pushing back. Airline associations called the new framework onerous and subjective. One high-profile executive even mocked it publicly on live television. "We're running flights, not feelings." That quote would haunt him. By week's end, 2 of his flights were grounded mid-boarding due to ethics score breaches. Passengers were rerouted to airlines in compliance. The stock dropped 14%. Henrietta didn't respond publicly, but she did underline one sentence in the next FAA draft update. Emotional intelligence is not an accessory, it's a requirement. Then came the day Henrietta visited Tokyo, her original flight's destination. The airline, JetPath, invited her to tour their Narita ground operations. What she didn't expect was what waited at the arrivals gate. 100 staff members, ground crew, pilots, flight attendants, stood in uniform, in silence. Each held a single placard that read, "Welcome, Ms. Lawson. You redefined how we serve." Henrietta bowed deeply, not out of pride, but out of hope. For the first time in decades, she felt the system turning, not just for her, but for everyone like her who'd been invisible for too long. That night, over dinner with the JetPath Tokyo lead, Henrietta was asked something surprising. If you could write one rule, just one, that airlines couldn't ignore, what would it be? She thought for a long moment, then said, "Silence does not mean weakness. The quietest passengers often carry the heaviest stories. Treat them like someone is watching, because now someone is." That sentence would later be printed on the back of every crew lanyard in JetPath's Pacific Division. They called it Henrietta's First Rule. As the season turned, more airlines joined the framework voluntarily. Not because of law, but because of pressure. Social, reputational, ethical. Passengers were now using dignity scores to choose flights. Shareholders began citing Ethics Watch ratings in quarterly reviews, and media outlets listed airlines by kindness quotient. The industry wasn't fully transformed yet, but it was no longer untouchable. And at the center of it all was a woman who didn't shout, didn't retaliate, didn't sue. She stood up quietly and rewrote everything. By now, the phrase Henrietta Lawson was no longer just a name. It had become a policy shift, a culture shift, a wake-up call. It started as a whisper in back offices. Then it echoed across boardrooms, Senate chambers, and cockpit lounges. But this chapter wasn't about the noise. It was about what happened next. Because sometimes, real change doesn't explode. It settles, quietly, permanently, into the way things are done. Henrietta sat in her garden again. This time, not to plan or calculate, but to reflect. The framework she'd helped draft, the Passenger Dignity Protocol, had now been adopted by 42 airports across 7 countries. 9 more were in negotiations. 3 booking platforms had added a Dignity Verified badge, visible to passengers. But what truly struck her wasn't the expansion. It was the stories. Letters arrived at her mailbox daily. One from a woman in Seattle who said her wheelchair-bound father had finally been treated with kindness at boarding. Another from a single mom in Atlanta whose autistic son wasn't asked to leave the gate area when he had a minor meltdown. And one from a flight attendant, a former skeptic, who wrote, "I thought this was about politics. I realize now it's about human basics." Henrietta read every letter. She replied to the ones that needed her words. But mostly, she listened, because the story had shifted, and she wasn't the victim anymore. Western Wings, meanwhile, was fighting for survival. After their stock plunged again, they fired the CEO. The board resigned, and in an unprecedented move, they offered Henrietta a seat as interim ethics chair. She declined, respectfully, firmly. "I don't fix reputations," she said. "I build futures." Instead, she recommended 2 former whistleblowers she'd mentored. Both women, both previously pushed out of the industry for speaking up. They accepted. And on their first day, they requested a public apology to Henrietta be issued by the airline's new leadership. It ran full page in 3 major newspapers. "To Ms. Lawson, we saw your age. We missed your wisdom. We apologize." One morning, a limo pulled up outside Henrietta's small home in Arlington. The man who stepped out wasn't from the FAA. He wasn't from a law firm or a network either. He was from the United Nations Global Council on Aviation Ethics. And he had a proposition. Would Henrietta serve as honorary ethics liaison for the creation of a new international passenger dignity framework? She asked how many pages the draft was. 243, the man said nervously. Henrietta smiled. Too long. Try this instead. She reached into her pocket and handed him a folded paper with only one sentence. Service is not what you give the loudest. It's what you offer the quietest. The man stared at it, then nodded. We'll start there. In Tokyo, JetPath launched the first passenger dignity lounge, a space designed not for luxury, but for care. No velvet ropes, no champagne, just accessible seating, multilingual staff, medical-ready assistants, and quiet zones for neurodivergent passengers. They named it the Lawson Lounge. Henrietta didn't attend the ribbon cutting. She didn't like being paraded, but she sent a message to the team. Dignity doesn't start when the plane takes off. It starts at the gate. That quote now sits on a plaque at the lounge's entrance. Meanwhile, Jillian, the former flight attendant, continued training at the dojo. She'd passed her orange belt test with discipline and humility, but her real test came when a reporter showed up at her door. They wanted her tell all about the viral flight. They offered money, exposure, sympathy. She declined. Instead, she wrote a letter to every airline HR department in the country. I wasn't fired for mocking a woman. I was lost. Henrietta didn't humiliate me. She handed me a map, and I'm still following it. Henrietta framed a copy in the dojo. Underneath it, she scribbled, "Redemption isn't loud. It's consistent." By fall, the FAA issued its final regulation update. Every airline operating domestic flights in the U.S. must adhere to passenger dignity baselines. Any breach triggers auto-review by the Ethics Oversight Committee, where Henrietta now sat as special counsel. Repeat violations lead to suspension of route clearances, ethics score freezes, and public red listing. For the first time, character mattered more than capital. Airlines scrambled. New crew training rolled out nationwide. Whistleblower protections were expanded, and, perhaps most importantly, quiet passengers were now heard first. Henrietta received one last letter that October. It was handwritten on soft cream paper from a woman in Florida. Dear Ms. Lawson, my mother is 81. She traveled last month for the first time in 12 years. She wore her old Navy karate gi on the plane, and someone in the crew asked her if she wanted water with lemon before takeoff. She said it made her feel seen. I think you had something to do with that. Thank you. Claire M. Henrietta folded the letter and held it to her chest, not for recognition, but for confirmation. The fight had been worth it. That evening, she walked out to her front porch, tea in hand. The wind was light. Leaves were beginning to turn. She wasn't just an old woman in a karate uniform anymore. She was a force woven into policy, into systems, into memory. And the next time someone looked at a passenger, elderly, silent, different, they might pause, might reconsider, might see strength where they once saw weakness. And when that happened, Henrietta wouldn't need to say a word. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. But when Henrietta Lawson opened her old laptop, entered a 12-digit code, and clicked send, it triggered a cascade across 9 international airports that no one in commercial aviation had ever seen before. To the untrained eye, nothing looked different. Flights continued boarding, planes taxied, coffee machines hummed at terminals. But inside the system, something had changed. 3 color-coded dashboards turned red. 7 airline compliance nodes froze. 4 booking platforms received simultaneous alerts. Ethics Watch Nexus, the platform Henrietta had co-authored decades ago, had just initiated a Level 4 dignity override. Western Wings had no idea what was coming. Back on the ground, Henrietta sat alone in her small home in Arlington. Her cup of tea steamed beside her. Calm, deliberate. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about returning the system to balance. In fact, Henrietta had waited 3 days since the flight before triggering the override. Not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. She wanted to see if the airline would self-correct. They didn't. No internal statement, no outreach, no suspension of the crew. Instead, their PR team doubled down, releasing a vague apology. "We're committed to our values and stand by our team's judgment." Translation? They thought she'd stay silent, but silence didn't mean absence. Henrietta's override reached Tokyo, Narita, London, Heathrow, Frankfurt International, Incheon, Seoul, Toronto, Pearson, Sydney, Kingsford, Smith, Dubai, International, Paris, Charles de Gaulle, New York, JFK. Each of these airports had previously signed the Ethics Watch Operational Accord, agreeing that any flagged, non-compliant passenger treatment event would automatically result in temporary hold-on gate privileges, suspension of real-time digital bookings for the carrier, immediate ethics review within 48 hours, a compliance score downgrade visible to regulators and investors. By the time Western Wings realized they'd been flagged, they were already locked out of boarding coordination in 9 cities. Executives scrambled. They called airports. They threatened legal action. They demanded clarity, but the only response came from the FAA's Ethics Enforcement Liaison. Clarity was denied to your passenger, so is access, until further notice. At Narita, passengers were escorted off a delayed Western Wings plane. At JFK, a terminal screen turned from on time to canceled. At Heathrow, a BBC crew was already reporting live on the unfolding disaster. Back in her home, Henrietta didn't turn on the news. She simply walked into her dojo, lit a stick of incense, and began a silent kata. The next morning, the airline's CEO, Gregory Harlan, called the Ethics Watch Council directly. He didn't expect Henrietta to be in the room. When her face appeared on the screen, his demeanor shifted. Not angry, not contrite, uneasy. "Ms. Lawson," he said, trying to stay composed. "Surely there's been a miscommunication." Henrietta simply replied, "There has. You mistook your authority for immunity." Gregory leaned forward. "We're losing millions every hour. The stock is crashing. We're being hammered by media." Henrietta cut in. Calm, controlled. "You should have thought about that before mocking a woman who wrote the system you now beg for leniency from." She didn't raise her voice, but the boardroom went silent. Over the next 24 hours, the financial repercussions were stunning. $210 million in canceled flight bookings, $37 million in temporary international gate contract losses, a 9.8% drop in Western Wings stock value, suspension of a $120 million investment package from 2 ESG funds, and perhaps more damaging than money, the public found out. Hashtags began trending. "I stand with Henrietta, #karate grandma knows law and how to respect." Passengers posted their own stories. Crew members leaked emails. Whistleblowers stepped forward. The narrative changed from one woman on a plane to a full-blown industry reckoning. Meanwhile, 3 other airlines that had borderline complaints rushed to issue preemptive reforms, not out of guilt, but fear of being next. They reviewed crew conduct logs, rolled out new training, even published public commitments to join the Dignity Score registry Henrietta had helped initiate. It was like watching dominoes fall, but Henrietta wasn't watching. She was still in her dojo, training with a young girl named May, who had joined just last week. Quiet, curious, respectful. May asked her during a break, "Sensei, why didn't you yell back that day on the plane?" Henrietta looked at her and said, "Because power doesn't raise its voice. It waits, and then makes the whole room listen." That night, JetPath, the airline that had supported Henrietta early on, invited her to co-lead a global ethics roundtable. The theme, "What happens when policy has a soul?" Henrietta's response, "I'll come, but I won't lecture. I'll listen. That's where every failure starts, where no one listens to the passenger." As for Western Wings, they were forced to appear before a joint ethics commission composed of FAA, EU regulators, and Ethics Watch. Henrietta didn't need to say anything at the hearing. The data did it for her. Passenger silence rate, 43% elderly passenger complaint rate, 3x industry average, crew empathy compliance score, 56, 100. Diversity and inclusion score, 42 on 100 when asked by the FAA chair, "Do you consider this an isolated event?" Henrietta replied, "No, sir. I consider it a culture in uniform." The FAA moved to strip Western Wings of 2 federal subsidies, and the European Commission suspended their priority gate status in Frankfurt and Heathrow. And Henrietta? She returned home. No victory parade, no headline chase, just her tea, and a gentle breeze through the open window. The world had changed because she didn't flinch, because she didn't scream. She endured, waited, then acted. And in doing so, she reminded the entire industry. The passenger you mock today may control the system you depend on tomorrow. 6 days had passed since the override. 9 airports had suspended Western Wings. Stockholders were furious. Boardrooms were bleeding. And still, the airline had not apologized to Henrietta directly. Until this morning. The knock on Henrietta Lawson's door came at 8:12 a.m. She wasn't surprised. She had already brewed tea. Years of practicing martial arts had taught her to sense intention before it showed up. When she opened the door, 2 people stood there. A woman in her early 40s, sharply dressed, tension in her shoulders, and behind her, a familiar face. Pale, nervous. Jillian, the flight attendant from the plane. Henrietta tilted her head, but said nothing. The woman stepped forward. "Ms. Lawson, I'm Marla Reddick, interim CEO of Western Wings." Henrietta didn't move, just nodded once. "We know this visit can't undo what happened, but I'm here because we finally understood what kind of system we're part of, and what kind of woman you are." They sat at the old kitchen table. Jillian didn't speak at first. Her hands fidgeted with the handle of her purse. Marla continued, "Our airline was operating under the illusion that policy was enough, that training manuals equaled compassion. But this week, we learned." Henrietta remained still, listening. Not forgiving, not judging. Just listening. Marla reached into her bag and pulled out a printed document. A formal ethics apology, signed by all 13 board members, including the newly reinstated whistleblower heads Henrietta had once mentored. Henrietta's eyes flicked across the page. Marla cleared her throat. "We'd like your permission to include your name on a new initiative, something we're launching publicly next month, the Lawson Principles. It'll be embedded into all onboarding, international crew operations, and gate protocols." Henrietta looked up. "Why now?" Marla didn't flinch. "Because we lost nearly $500 million in 1 week, and realized none of it mattered if we lost public trust for good." Jillian finally spoke. "Ms. Lawson," her voice cracked. She took a breath. "That day on the flight, I mocked you because I thought I could. I thought you were nobody. I thought a woman in a GI didn't belong in first class." Henrietta watched her. Still no expression. Jillian's eyes filled with tears. "But I've been training at the dojo. I understand now, not just discipline, but what it means to see people. Sensei Shin said something last week. He said, 'The belt isn't for your waist, it's for your eyes, so you know when to bow.'" She looked down. "I didn't know when to bow." Henrietta finally spoke, softly. "Do you now?" Jillian nodded, ashamed. Henrietta didn't lecture. She didn't scold. She simply poured tea for all 3 of them. Later that afternoon, Western Wings released a surprise press statement. This time, not drafted by legal. It began, "This is not an apology from our lawyers. This is an apology from our leadership, our flight crews, and our future selves." They acknowledged the incident, named Henrietta, declared an internal overhaul of their ethics systems, and most importantly, pledged to submit all crew members to independent dignity audits every year, using Henrietta's scoring framework. The public response was unexpectedly massive. Not because people love the airline again, but because finally, someone powerful admitted they were wrong. Letters poured in. One from a retired general. "I've seen battles won and lost. This was the first time I saw dignity win at cruising altitude." Another from a single father in Detroit. "I travel with my son who has Down syndrome. Thank you for showing what restraint looks like in power." And yet another, anonymously. "I work for a rival airline. We've started reviewing our own policies because we don't want to be next." 3 days later, Henrietta received a letter from the FAA's Internal Reform Division. "Dear Ms. Lawson, we've created a new advisory role, Senior Passenger Ethics Architect. We'd like you to serve, not because of your title, but because of your actions." Respectfully, FAA Ethics Task Force Chair Henrietta chuckled when she read it. She wasn't chasing titles. She was chasing systems that outlived her. "Still," she replied, "if I accept, I want 2 things. Quarterly reporting of dignity violations by age, disability, and race. Mandatory humility training, not just DEI slides, but scenario-based learning." The FAA replied the next day. "Approved." At the dojo that evening, Shin approached Henrietta with a small package. "From May," he said. "She wanted you to have this." Henrietta opened it and found a hand-drawn picture. It was a crayon sketch of a woman in a karate gi, sitting on a plane, surrounded by sparkles, with the words, "Strong is quiet. Quiet is strong." Henrietta smiled. The picture went straight to the dojo's front wall, under the framed ethics certificate she'd received from the UN the week before. That certificate didn't make her tear up, but the drawing? It nearly did. Across the industry, ripple effects continued. 3 airlines voluntarily opted into the passenger equity framework. Booking.com added a passenger treatment score to flight listings. Congress began talks for the Airborne Dignity Act, modeled in part on Henrietta's story. And best of all, for the first time ever, airline staff began greeting passengers like Henrietta with a bow, not out of obligation, but because they had learned when to bow. The following spring, Terminal D at JFK Airport looked different. It wasn't the layout. It wasn't the lighting. It was the energy. Passengers moved more mindfully. Gate agents smiled without force. Crew uniforms now bore a small silver emblem on the sleeve, a circle with a silent bow silhouette. And just above Gate D22 hung a bronze plaque, newly installed. It read, "In honor of Henrietta Lawson." She didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. The dedication ceremony was quiet, just like the woman it honored. FAA officials, aviation reform advocates, airport staff, and a handful of reporters gathered under the soft glow of morning. Henrietta stood in a crisp navy gi, flanked by May and 2 other girls from the Arlington dojo. She said nothing for the first few minutes, just let the silence settle. Then, with her hands folded in front of her, she finally spoke. "I was never angry at one flight attendant. I was disappointed in an industry that confused training with wisdom. I didn't want retribution. I wanted remembrance of what respect used to feel like." The crowd was still. No claps, no cheers, just quiet respect. After the plaque was unveiled, a woman in her 60s approached Henrietta with tears in her eyes. "I was on that flight," she said. "You didn't see me, but I saw you. I stayed silent. I was afraid to say something." Henrietta gently touched her arm. "You're saying something now." The woman nodded, sobbing quietly. That same week, 3 more airlines joined the passenger equity framework. More importantly, a coalition of airports launched a pilot program, the Lawson Index, a monthly, publicly available scorecard measuring how airlines treat their most vulnerable passengers, the elderly, the disabled, and the culturally misunderstood. It wasn't mandatory yet, but public pressure was mounting. Every time a high score was posted, customers responded with loyalty. Every time a low score dropped, ticket sales dipped. Suddenly, Dignity had a dollar value. Meanwhile, at the Arlington dojo, something subtle had shifted. More older women were joining, not just to learn self-defense, but to remember who they were before the world asked them to shrink. One afternoon, May asked Henrietta while stretching, "Do you think they really changed, Sensei?" Henrietta smiled. "Not all of them, but enough. And that's how change begins." On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Western Wings did something unexpected. They invited Henrietta to fly first class again, this time on their new Respect Line route, dedicated to ethical travel standards. Henrietta accepted. When she boarded, the crew bowed deeply, not performatively, but sincerely. At her seat, instead of champagne, there was a sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Jillian. "You taught me more in 30 minutes of silence than I learned in 7 years of customer service training. Thank you for not giving up on people like me." Henrietta folded the letter. She didn't need praise, but she accepted the apology, not with words, but with a nod. As the plane took off, May, seated beside her, grinned. "This is so weird. Last time we flew, you were the karate grandma that no one believed. Now you're like industry legend." Henrietta chuckled. "Legends are for stories. I'm just someone who stayed in her seat." Final scene. Back at JFK, a young agent noticed an older black woman walking toward Gate B9 in a soft gray GI. A few years ago, that might have earned a smirk. Today, the agent stood, straightened his uniform, and bowed slightly. The woman stopped, surprised. Then she smiled. Somewhere in the background, a child whispered to her mom, "Is that her?" The mom replied, "No, but someone like her made this place safer for all of us." 3 months after Henrietta's first-class silence triggered a nationwide conversation, something even bigger happened, this time behind closed doors. The Department of Transportation, FAA, and Congressional Ethics Committee were all about to attend a private joint session. The subject? Proposed National Passenger Equity Standards, Henrietta Lawson Framework. Henrietta wasn't in the room, but her presence was everywhere. Inside a sleek chamber at the Capitol, folders were passed around to senators, agency directors, and airline CEOs. The cover read, "The Lawson Protocol, a federal passenger ethics blueprint," authored by an unexpected trio, a retired ethics advisor from the UN, the whistleblower union leader reinstated after Henrietta's incident, and Henrietta herself listed humbly as civilian advocate and first-class passenger number 12A. Across the hall, in a press-free conference room, the aviation industry's top executives were already growing nervous. Why? Because the protocol wasn't just symbolic. It had teeth. It proposed that all major airlines undergo quarterly dignity audits, made public on federal dashboards. Airlines scoring below a set threshold would lose eligibility for federal subsidies. FAA certification would now require passing both safety and ethical passenger conduct metrics. No longer could ethics be a PR game. Now, it would be a licensing condition. Meanwhile, back in Arlington, Henrietta wasn't following the live updates. She was helping May break her first cinder block at the dojo. As the block cracked clean in two, May's hands trembled, but her smile didn't. "I couldn't have done this a year ago," she said, breathless. Henrietta handed her a towel. "You didn't need to do it then. You needed to know you could." That night, a call came to Henrietta's home. "Ma'am," the voice on the line said, "this is Senator Avery. The vote just passed. The Lawson Protocol is now a federal standard." Henrietta didn't cheer. She didn't even stand. She just whispered, "Then maybe the skies will finally feel safe again. For everyone." The next morning, the headlines hit. Congress approves federal passenger ethics law. Lawson Protocol to redefine air travel standards. Flight crew behavior now, subject to federal ethics scores. And quietly, 9 more airlines signed onto the passenger equity framework to avoid being caught behind. Later that week, Henrietta was invited to a televised interview on a national morning show. The host began with a soft smile. "Ms. Lawson, you never raised your voice, but you helped raise the bar. How?" Henrietta adjusted her glasses. "By staying in my seat and making sure no one gets removed from theirs unjustly ever again." The host leaned forward. "Do you consider yourself an activist?" Henrietta chuckled. "No, I consider myself a witness. I saw something wrong, and I chose not to look away." Clips from the interview went viral, but it wasn't the sound bites that moved people. It was her demeanor, her quiet firmness, her refusal to be either bitter or boastful. In Detroit, a group of retired nurses formed the Lawson League, organizing airport dignity observers. In Seattle, a high school art teacher built a curriculum called Ethics in Motion, using Henrietta's story to teach civics and character. And in New York City, the Metropolitan Museum announced a special photography exhibit, Seat 12A, the woman who reclaimed her space. Meanwhile, Western Wings, now under interim CEO Marla Reddick, hosted a rare all-staff town hall. Every crew member was required to watch a short film during the session. It opened with footage of that infamous flight, audio of laughter, then silence, then footage of airports freezing partnerships. The final slide? A still image of Henrietta, sitting calmly. With the caption, "One passenger, one moment, one change." Marla stepped on stage and said simply, "If you ever forget why this matters, look at that seat and ask yourself who might be watching." As the season turned, something extraordinary happened at the Arlington dojo. A special ceremony was held, May's black belt test. Henrietta oversaw the final evaluation alongside Sensei Shin. After a series of precise, graceful kata and a breaking sequence that drew gasps from the parents in attendance, May was handed her belt. But instead of putting it on immediately, she turned to Henrietta and said, "Sensei, I want to give you this." Henrietta blinked. "Why?" "Because I only earned it. Because someone believed I could. I want my belt to mean what yours meant to me." Henrietta's hands shook as she accepted it, not from age, from emotion. That night she sat on her porch with tea, staring at the stars. She thought of all the flights she'd taken, all the stares, the moments of invisibility, the whispers about that old lady with the weird outfit. And then she smiled. Because now, somewhere out there, a young woman in a gi might walk into first class, and no one would dare ask her to move. The sun spilled gently across Henrietta's small backyard in Arlington, Virginia. A year had passed. A year since a flight attendant's mocking laugh echoed across first class. A year since Henrietta Lawson chose silence over spectacle and watched the world shift around her. She sat on a wooden bench near her rose bushes, wearing a soft cotton gi. Not the starched white one she'd worn that day, but one that had faded over decades of quiet discipline. She held a letter in her hands, handwritten, from someone she never expected. "Dear Ms. Lawson, I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I remember everything. The sound of my own voice, the way I laughed with the others. I thought I was being witty. I wasn't. I was cruel. That flight changed you, yes, but it changed me more than you'll ever know. I resigned from Western Wings 2 months after the incident. I took a job training new crew members on dignity, on restraint, on how to see who's sitting in front of them before deciding who they are. I show them your photo. You didn't scold me. You didn't demand anything. You just held your space, and that silence did more than a lawsuit ever could. Thank you. Jillian H." Henrietta folded the letter slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just breathed. Later that week, she returned to the dojo for a different kind of lesson. Not teaching, listening. The dojo had invited a new generation of students, young, old, multilingual, some with visible disabilities, others with invisible ones. All of them wore a GI. All of them had read her story. They didn't come to learn how to fight. They came to learn how to stand, how to sit, how to endure. May, now a junior instructor, watched as Henrietta entered. The room quieted immediately. Henrietta bowed to the class, then walked straight to the back and sat among the students. "I came," she said gently, "to listen." And that's what she did. As each student stood and introduced themselves, shaky voices, stammering words, different accents, Henrietta nodded after each one. When they finished, she finally rose and spoke. "There are fights in life that don't involve fists," she said. "Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is not react the way they expect." Meanwhile, at Western Wings, a very different kind of transformation was taking place. The airline had recently partnered with the FAA to pilot a nationwide campaign called Know Who's Seated, an initiative focused on rehumanizing airline service through empathy training, equity review panels, and digital tracking of passenger dignity reports. Each participating crew member now carried a small black card clipped inside their uniform jacket. On one side, their employee ID. On the other, a single phrase: "Dignity is seatless." It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being aware. Henrietta was invited to the launch. She declined the spotlight. Instead, she requested that the seat, 12A from that infamous flight, be retired and placed in the Aviation Ethics Museum in DC. The airline agreed. Months later, that seat, worn leather, slightly creased, unremarkable in design, was unveiled behind glass. Below it, a simple plaque. This seat was never raised. It was held with grace, with silence, with power. In honor of Henrietta Lawson. The final ripple came not from politics or press, but from children. In a small elementary school in Michigan, a fifth-grade class was asked to name someone they admired. Some said athletes, some said doctors. One girl raised her hand. "I want to be like Miss Henrietta," she said, holding up a printout from an old newspaper article. The teacher asked why. Because she didn't need to hit anybody to make the whole country listen. Henrietta never set out to become anyone's example. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on book tours. She didn't launch a movement. She just stayed seated, in a place where she had every right to be. And by doing so, she reminded an entire nation that dignity is not loud, it's constant, it's earned, and when honored, it changes more than policy. It changes people. Final image. Henrietta, walking through the boarding gate years later. Older now, softer in step, still wearing her GI. As she approaches the first-class section, the crew stands at attention. One of them bows deeply. She nods in return. No words, just presence. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to shift the world. Henrietta didn't shout. She didn't fight back with anger. But the system still changed because she held her space. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until the moment they stood tall without saying a word? Tell us where you're watching from. And if someone like Henrietta ever inspired you to stay true, even when the world tried to push you aside. We read every comment here on Telltales. And trust me, your story might just be the one someone else needs to hear tonight.